Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by MEDTEQ Plus in collaboration with Health Canada. My name is Karine Huillier. I'm the Director of Partnerships, Research and Innovation at MEDTEQ Plus, and I'm very pleased to present the agenda for this webinar. First of all, I would like to inform you that your microphones and camera have been automatically turned off and that you cannot turn them on. So if you wish to ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and please do not use the chat. Thank you very much for that. So first, I will give a quick presentation of MEDTEQ Plus, and then I will hand over to the Health Canada expert for two very interesting sessions. So the first session will be regulation of medical device investigational testing, followed by a question period. And then we will have a session on digital health and artificial intelligence in healthcare, a regulator's perspective, followed also by a question period. So can we go to next slide, please? So next slide again, sorry. So MEDTEQ Plus is a non-for-profit industry consortium funded in 2013 by the Quebec government. And our mission is to accelerate innovation in medical technologies. To fulfill this mission, we have grant programs for collaborative projects between academic and clinical centers and companies. The funding comes from the Ministry of Economy and Innovation in Quebec. Can we go to, already next slide, okay. So since 2017, we have also received funding from the federal government through the Centers of Excellence in Commercialization of Research program. With this funding, our most specific mission is really to accelerate the integration, adoption, and commercialization of health technologies in Canada. So to do so, we have two different tools. We have an investment fund that allows us to invest in highly innovative SMEs and startups, and also a network of clinical centers of excellence across Canada and even internationally, with which we have structures, a process for testing and integrating innovation. So we call this network the beachhead network. Sorry. Can we go to next slide, please? So as you can see from this slide, our programs and tools are available across the innovation continuum, represented here by the TRL scale, from really the idea through prototyping and validation in real-world settings to commercializations. And we also have, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, a coaching program that we have in partnership with the NRC IRAP program. Can we go to next slide, please? So before passing the mic to the next Health Canada expert for the first session, I would like to mention a few important dates. So the next deadline, if you wish to submit a proposal to the impact program, will be August 10. And for the Partenariat program, it will be October 14. And for the Beachhead Network, it is coming soon, so stay tuned. Also in the coming weeks, we will also be recruiting our next cohort of companies for the coaching program. Can we go to next slide, please? So thank you very much for your attention, and please do not hesitate to contact us if you would like more information on our programs and our tools. So I will now introduce the first speaker, which is BC Lawouyi. So BC is the manager of the Investigational Testing and Special Access Division within the Medical Devices Directorate. The division provides regulatory oversight of unlicensed medical devices used in clinical trials, as well as those used for emergency access when alternatives are unsuitable, unavailable, or have failed. She has worked within the Directorate, formerly known as the Medical Devices Bureau, for 15 years in different divisions. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry, a Bachelor of Applied Science in Chemical Engineering, and a Master in Biomedical Engineering. So, BC, the mic is yours. Thank you. Enjoy the webinar. You're on mute, BC.
Sorry about that. How about that? So good afternoon, everyone. We'll try again. I'm pleased to be here. and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad I'm able to be here to share a little bit on behalf of Health Canada and share on our investigational testing regulations. Prior to beginning, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I am delivering my presentation from the National Capital Region, seated on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The people have and continue to live and nurture this territory. And so we recognize this, the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, as well as all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and their contributions to the land. Thank you very much.
BC, we don't see your presentation.
With that, I will begin to share my presentation.
Oh, perfect.
Bear with me. Excellent. My name is Ndisi Lawi. As I was introduced, I'm the manager of the Investigational Testing and Special Access Division within Health Canada. And I'm going to share particularly on the regulations involving medical devices used in investigational testing, synonymously called clinical trials. I'll probably bounce between the two terms, but they're synonymous. There's quite a bit of content in the slides. I'm
Sorry to interrupt you. We see your notes. We don't see your presentation.
Apologies for that. How's share screen? Do you have them available, Karen?
Yes.
Trying just to share.
Would you like me to share my screen?
Yes, let me stop sharing and I'll let you go ahead. Thank you for that. So if we can go to the next one. There we go. Okay, so as I had mentioned that there's quite a bit of information in our slides. I'm going to touch at a very high level, but nonetheless, feel free to ask any questions afterwards. So maybe the four main areas we're going to talk about just at a high level are directorate and how we're organized, followed by the regulations, which are the medical device regulations, the main regulatory authority by which we authorize and regulate clinical trials and the devices used in them. And then I'll touch on again at a high level, two more of the modern and new regulations that we have been involved. One related to COVID-19 medical devices, and another, the Clinical Trials Regulatory Modernization Project, which is in development, new regulations that will come into force in the future. So next slide, please. So here we are as organized, the Medical Devices Directorate, formerly the Medical Devices Bureau. We're now organized with the organized into about 6 bureaus. I do notice that the Bureau of Evaluation for COVID medical devices is not displayed there. That's a recent bureau that has been set up. But the main 6 bureaus are here, and particularly highlighted are there 2 that are involved heavily in clinical trial evaluation. So the Bureau of Investigational Testing and Special Access, where the Investigational Testing Division lies, my division, as well as the Bureau of Evaluation. That team is involved in the actual licensing, the pre-market approvals of medical devices, and also participates within the clinical trial evaluation reviews. That Bureau of Evaluation broken up into 5 different groups as listed there, based on the type of device: cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, in vitro diagnostics, general and restorative, and digital health, which we'll hear from Mark Lemera a little bit later on that last particular division and their work. I haven't taken the time really to go into details on how devices themselves are regulated. There was a previous presentation a couple months ago delivered by someone from the Bureau of Licensing. But of particular note is that the regulation of devices is a risk-based approach. Devices are classified from class 1 to class 4 based on the type of risk they present. And usually information, the type of oversight is in relation to the type of risk they are categorized. If we can go to the next slide. There we go. So part 3 of the medical devices regulations that oversees the clinical trials and particularly relates to the importation of sale of a medical device that is used for testing involving human subjects. Of particular note is the fact that no person shall import or sell any device unless you have that authorization and possess records related to Section 81. And I'll touch a little bit upon that in the subsequent slides. In the case of class 2, 3, or 4 devices. So you need to have an authorization and have the records in your possession prior to initiating any type of clinical trials with those devices. Class 1 devices do not require authorization. Nonetheless, you need to possess the records that are stipulated within the MDR. If you want to go ahead to the next slide. Here we highlight within the regulations the main 3 conditions that need to be met for an authorization to be granted. And all details are there again, but if I really summarize, what you really need to demonstrate is the fact that the device is safe, that the testing is not contrary to the best interests of the patients or any other users involved. So risks essentially are outweighed by the benefits and that it's ethical, if you want to summarize that. And then the third, that the objectives of the studies are achievable. Next slide. So a few points of interest, common questions that we get regarding ITAs. 1, they are to be submitted by the manufacturer. So the regulations specifically apply to the importer and or manufacturer. A clinician or investigator who wants to apply can do so. The manufacturer needs to delegate that authority to them. It's by signing off the application form and giving them authority, and they can put the package together. But essentially the authorization is to the manufacturer and or importer to sell the device. There are no fees associated with these applications, and particularly the authorization applies to the clinical trial. It's not a guarantee that because it's been granted the ITA, that when the trial has been completed, it's going to be granted a license for pre-market approval. It's not a direct guarantee on that. And further, for the 4th point, that authorization is specific for the device to be used in that trial. It does not give permission to continue to use that device beyond. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please. Just highlighting here for your information, when you need an ITA, when you don't, we get that question very often. Essentially, if there's an importation of sale of an unlicensed class 2, 3, or 4 medical device, also in cases when there's a licensed device and it's being used outside of its license indication. So expanding its indications for use, especially when there's a manufacturer involved, you need an ITA. Cases where you wouldn't are for class 1 devices. As I mentioned, you don't need the authorization if the product does not meet the definition of a medical device as per the regulations, or phase 4 trials, as we call them. So when you're using the device within the scope of what it's approved for, it might be a cost-effectiveness study or anything like that. You don't need an ITA because it has been authorized, or it has been licensed, I should say. We can go ahead to the next slide. Quick snapshot here, just to let you know in terms of the numbers of applications we're seeing. This is 2021. Numbers are down still since 2020 when the pandemic hit, but starting to rebound back as we get back to a little bit of a normal. But we saw 140 ITAs that were new for new devices we hadn't seen, 212 revisions, so some type of a change or update to ITAs within that year. Breakdowns there, we're mostly seeing class 2 and 3 devices, and then as well the type of devices that we see, largely the general restorative digital health type devices. Those are the heavy hitters right now. We can go ahead to the next slide. So as I mentioned, that the regulations specify the type of records that need to be kept. For class 2 devices, of those records, the ones that are highlighted in bold need to be provided at a minimum in your application. Other information still needs to be retained. Some higher risk class 2 also would be subjected to the other things that are not bolded because they may impact the safety of. And for class 3 and 4 devices, all the information specified there should be provided in the submission as applicable. And it's administrative information, device information, information to support the risk benefit profile. So whether it be the bench testing or conformity to standards and the such, as well as the protocol specific information and investigational site information. We can proceed to the next slide. So another thing I highlight here, because often we get the question from investigators who may be less familiar with what the requirements are, since most of the applications come from manufacturers, what are their obligations and what information do they need to provide specific to them. So I highlight those here. Don't know how many investigators we have here joining us, but the information for the investigator, their contact information, a CV needs to be provided as well. An investigator agreement, which is specified within the regulations, and it's particularly their attestation that they will conform to their obligation, whether it be the conduct of the study, informing patients, use of the device, and reporting as well. Next slide. Institutional information and research ethics board approval information are required within the application as well. For class 2 devices, of course, for all cases, they need to be, REB approval needs to be obtained before you initiate the study, but for class 3 and 4, that information of REB approval needs to be provided to us before you go ahead with the study. Okay, we can go ahead to the next. So typically, you know, the simplest type of applications we get is for one device in one simple clinical trial and it's approved. But we do get, and many manufacturers are looking at studies where they might use a single device in multiple studies, or the study might involve multiple unlicensed devices that are subject of the ITA. In terms of how we deal with that, we often encourage and work with manufacturers to send them together in a bundle type fashion, and we review them together. Duplicate information can be submitted in one and cross-referenced in the other, so as to ease the burden on that application. But each device and each study would require a separate application, an ITA, but they can be bundled together for simplicity. We also see cases where unlicensed devices that are part of the clinical trial are being used in a drug clinical trial. So both tend to be investigational or both are unlicensed, in which case authorization from both parties, which is the Medical Devices Bureau, Medical Devices Directorate, and the Drugs Bureaus, needs to be obtained prior to initiation of the study. And as well, combination products, for instance, maybe a drug-eluting stent, when the product combines device components and drug components in one, it just requires one application that'll go to the bureau where the primary mode of action of the device is what is being evaluated for the therapy. But we jointly internally will work together to complete that review. So it's one application, but it's coordinated internally by the two of us. Next slide, please. The regulations also speak to post-authorization requirements. I won't go into too much detail, but they relate to mandatory reporting for both manufacturers and investigators and the time frames and how they should be submitted. Next one, please. Other obligations. So ISO 14155, which is the good clinical practices standard, differs from what the drugs requirements are, though there are many similarities between the two. It is not a requirement as specified under regulations. However, it is highly recommended that during the practice of the study that conformity to the principles within ISO 14155 are applied. Next slide. Again, many other obligations that are in the regulations relate to the advertising, distribution, complaint handling, and implant registration, as well as once an ITA is approved, what type of revisions need to be approved prior to implementation. Things like if there's a suspension of the trial, if there's any discontinuation, when it's completed and the closure of the study, what should be done. So guidance as well as the regulations provide information on various points and how to go ahead and inform our directorate when these are occurring. Next slide. So I spoke about the current regulations. Moving on to some of the newer regulatory provisions that have put in place. So specifically 2020 with the onset of the pandemic, provisions were put in place specific to COVID devices used for COVID treatments and clinical trials. It required agile concepts to allow for, quick access to devices to be studied and to get onto the market. And so the interim order was put in place. It was followed by a second interim order and then subsequently new regulations that were launched earlier this year to address these needs. And they specifically implemented flexibilities, for instance, broadening who can apply for these authorizations, not just the manufacturer, but now also investigators, types of amendments and changes that can be made. Terms and conditions, so authorizing with some types of terms and conditions for follow-up and continuation of these studies, as well as enhanced means for informed consent, whether it be virtual and decentralized trials and the such. If we go on to the next slide. Here, just kind of paralleling the two pathways for COVID-19 devices, medical devices regulations still in effect and exist. But the COVID-19 regulations offer some flexibilities and such devices can go through either pathway depending on the need. The next slide. So that was one of the more recent regulations. There's also the Clinical Trials Regulatory Modernization Project, and that's one of the ongoing projects. I highly recommend that you refer to our website and update yourself with what's going on and you provide your feedback, get involved because we want to hear. The key goal here is encouraging clinical trials in Canada, encouraging innovation and seeing how we can do that in a safe way. So the overarching principles still remain to ensure protection and safety of the research subjects, but yet still we want to increase R&D in Canada and increase in confidence in the integrity of the data that's being obtained for such trials. So looking at no longer just authorizing the sale and importation of products, but increasing flexibilities that we oversee the conduct of the trial, flexibilities to who can apply. Also clinical trial information that now will be available and transparent. So mandating that information be published for the public to be informed of when trials are being, when they're initiated and their completion and such. Also, one key goal that we're looking at is alignment between the different product lines. So the similarities and differences can be merged together and even having one single authorization and an application when you have multiple products, whether it be a drug, a biologic, a device used in one trial. And next slide. I won't go into too much detail about this, but this is part of the clinical trial regulatory modernization and the risk-based approach to organizing and completing who applies, how much information needs to be submitted, when things are exempt, what are the obligations. So primarily looking at risk-based categorization of devices and their corresponding requirements. Next slide. Again, a summary of the regulatory modernization project. You can see more information online, seeing where we are and where we're going to, as I mentioned, manufacturers, importers, currently the ones who are permitted to apply, looking at expanding it to include investigators, having one single authorization for multiple products used in a trial. Next slide. Putting more information to clarify the need for RAB approval and the timing, which is not currently within our regulations. And also expanding the provisions for partial suspension or cancellation of a trial. Currently, it's all done we could suspend a trial within part or whole, but we can cancel a trial within part or whole, but looking at temporary suspensions, partial suspensions of part, whether it be an arm or the whole trial, to allow more flexibility and agility as clinical trials are being developed, arms are being added, removed, etc. Next slide, please. Another key implementation with the regulatory modernization will be the mandating of good clinical practices. As I mentioned before, it's recommended, but not within the regulations, but including such provisions within the current regulations to ensure patient safety. More flexibility for off-label use devices. Compliance and enforcement as well will be a new addition, which is currently doesn't involve inspections of clinical trials of medical devices, but expanding those, as well as other many provisions that have been included there and listed there, but I won't belabor all those points. There was one more. So just to summarize where we are, where we're going to really looks at supporting research and innovation, and kind of why we're here to share with you where we are and what we'd like to encourage more participation, encourage feedback from you out there as we try to develop regulations, increase innovation, greater access to devices and trials and research in Canada. And with that, I thank you very much, and I open the floor for any questions.
Thank you very much, PC. It was very, very interesting. So we do have a question. Will the contact information be provided for each speaker? So I think that there was a general email address on the last slide of the presentation. So BC, would you recommend to address all questions to this address if the participants have questions about your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be the most efficient. If it needs to be directed to me, I can. I have a team as well who can help with any application regulatory questions you may have in a timely manner as well. So that would be the best method.
Okay, perfect. Maybe we can type the address, the email address on the chat, so the participant can, copy paste the email address. Okay, perfect. So Atina already took care of that. So wonderful. So I don't see any other questions. Maybe I have just one for you, BC. What would be your advice? I mean, if you have to just give one or two advices for the participants, if they are planning on submitting an ITA to Health Canada, what would be, the first step to do?
Yeah. So the first step, once you have your device, you have a trial, you have an objective that you want to look at, you need to know the class of the device, because that will be what directs the type of information that needs to be submitted. So classification, there's information on the website if you're not familiar with what the class is. We have a guidance posted online, but if you're unsure, you can also reach out to the general email in terms of how to prepare your submission. That's key. I think a lot of time sometimes is lost in the back and forth, not realizing what needs to be submitting, forgetting certain submission requirements, whether it be the informed consent or the investigator agreement and the such. And I think that delays sometimes the processing of the application. And ensure that all documents are complete, it's submitted in the correct format. And if there are any questions, reach out to us in advance so we can help to address that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I see another questions. Do you have any advice on acquiring ISO/CSA documents at a reasonable cost, or is there a way to facilitate access?
So I'll be honest, I'm not directly involved in accessing the information. I can reach out to our team. They are definitely available online, but I do realize that the cost may be prohibitive to some. But,
okay,
I'd have to reach out to my team that is involved in purchasing those.
Okay, thank you very much. So I don't see any other questions. So I propose that we jump onto the next sessions. So I will just quickly present the next speaker, which is Marc Lamoureux. So Marc holds a Bachelor of Science in Biophysics and a Master in Medical Physics. After graduate work in medical imaging at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, Marc was a medical health physicist with the Ottawa hospitals, where he worked closely with federal and provincial regulatory bodies to improve the quality and safety of diagnostic and therapeutic radiation programs. Since 2011, Marc has worked at Health Canada, specializing in the technical assessments of medical software, diagnostic imaging devices, and radiotherapy equipment. He is vice chair of Canada's IEC subcommittees for diagnostic imaging and radiotherapy, and he co-chairs the International Medical Device Regulators Forum's Cybersecurity Working Group with the US FDA. He is heavily involved in innovative policies to adapt Canada's regulatory framework for emerging technologies. He is currently Health Canada's lead for the G7's Digital Health AI Governance Working Group, and he is a member of the National Advisory Council on AI in Healthcare and leads the Digital Health Division at Health Canada. So thank you. And so I will pass the mic to Marc.
Hi everyone, merci Karine, and excuse the all the acronyms. We come from government, so there's a ton of acronyms. My name is Marc Lamoureux. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for having me today, and those of you in attendance for your interest. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. So for maybe the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to cover 4 topics, and I'm hoping that I'm going to get yelled at if no one can see my screen, but I haven't heard anything yet, so it looks like everyone's okay. Please let me know if you can.
You're good.
Thank you. The 4 topics, I think I'm going to start with number 1, and that's really just to introduce the actual presentation on digital health and AI. I promise to be short on agenda number 1. After that, the other 3, I'll focus on the clinical applications of AI. We get that question a lot. I'll explain why I use AI and ML. Number 3, the considerations that we as a product regulator need to make when we regulate this type of technology. And finally, I want to highlight that regulating software and AI in healthcare anyways is not a domestic problem. It's not a Canadian problem. Health Canada is heavily involved on the global stage, and we're trying to make connections with other regulators to ensure the sort of alignment that I'm going to speak a little bit about. Okay, so just terminology out of the way. You know, when we say medical device, you know, what does that mean? And many of you I know, but there's a clear definition in Canadian law, and briefly, it's a thing that's manufactured, sold, or represented for use in diagnosing, treating, mitigating, or preventing disease in humans, obviously. There's a reason I bring this up in this type of this sort of technology, software, AI discussion, is that people always ask, you know, is an app a medical device? Can software be a medical device? What about software that uses AI? And our answer is that if it meets that definition of treating or diagnosing or preventing, then yeah, it's a medical device, and it's a regulated product. On the right side of this slide, I simply just wanted to show you the makeup of the medical devices program. I saw that BC went over that with you. I just want to highlight that there's sort of a pre-market group, a post-market group, a compliance and enforcement group, as well as some policy and operations and executive group. I come from the pre-market authorization group. When a product needs to enter the Canadian market, or wants to, you know, the applicant wants the product to enter the Canadian market, I lead one of the technical teams responsible for the assessment of that product. Bottom, showing the risk class for those who don't know. You know, class 1 to class 4, that's how we operate in Canada, and our regulatory activities are based heavily on the risk of the product, right? So a Band-Aid is a medical device, you know, but our technical teams, the physicists and engineers that work for me, do not assess test reports for toothbrushes. We will, however, spend weeks assessing a cancer therapy device, for example. So moving right along, I promise I'll be quick on number 1. Digital health. Okay, so let's narrow the focus a little bit on this to digital health. And for us as a product regulator, our definition of digital health is really constrained to policies and products that make healthcare more accessible, that improve and facilitate timely diagnoses, as well as foster remote healthcare. And in 2018, and it seems like eons ago, 4 years ago, Health Canada created a new digital health division, right? And that was to increase our capacity for regulating software, to address medical device cybersecurity, and to move forward on a lot of AI-enabled healthcare products, and move forward our regulatory frameworks to account for the changing landscape, the changing technology. I included a QR code there. That's just some further information on the digital health division. Okay, so software's evolving landscape. This arrow doesn't show every exception, but it's meant to demonstrate a general trend that I've seen, at least in the past decade that I've been with Health Canada, as it relates to software. So back in the day, software generally in the medical device world was more or less used to control hardware medical devices, right? Many years ago. And again, not an exception, just in general. But as we move forward in time, we started to see more emergence of software as a medical device. So software applications only that fit that medical device definition. And moving further even more to the right, we're seeing more emerging tech. We're seeing artificial intelligence. We're seeing different software delivery models. Perhaps maybe, maybe this shows my age a little bit, when you used to get a software application on a disk or multiple disks, right? And then it went to CD, and then now it's online, right? So if you buy Microsoft Office right now, you may just get a download code. Well, how does the regulator kind of adapt to a changing sort of delivery model, not necessarily the product? We're seeing software as a service, cloud computing, and the like. So in the digital health world, the pace of development is really quick. The novelty of some of the innovations make it really difficult to regulate, really, because there's sometimes even no precedent. And some of these devices need updating, very near continuous updating, right? So in the digital health world, I always like to say that the regulation must look a little different to kind of account for the technology. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Next, the rest of the talk will be on AI and AI-related features of what we do. Okay, so maybe more terminology out of the way. I went over medical device and all that stuff. And many of you may have seen this diagram in various forms. This is from a relatively old diagnostic imaging publication, but I find it extremely useful, and it really nails the definitions. This picture shows that machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence, right? It says that artificial intelligence is a subfield of computer science devoted to creating systems that perform tasks that ordinarily require human intelligence. That's super broad. Anyone with a Roomba at home, that could be considered AI if you're looking at this definition, right? Now let's look at machine learning. It's a subfield of AI where computers are trained to perform tasks without explicit programming. That is typically when a regulator discusses AI and machine learning, this is what we're talking about. Algorithms or models that are trained on data and presumably get better at their task with more exposure to data. I won't talk about representation learning or deep learning. And I have to apologize. I have been, and I will be, speaking about AI quite a bit, but I use the terms interchangeably, AI and machine learning, right? I'm typically referring to software that has employed some level of machine learning, and that's why we call it AI/ML. It's artificial intelligence, but more specifically, it's machine learning. Okay, and that's why you'll see a lot of regulatory documents coming from Canada, as well as other jurisdictions that have AI/ML. Okay, so we haven't seen a tidal wave of medical device license applications for sort of AI-enabled or ML-enabled medical devices, but we've seen a big increase, especially over the last maybe 3 years or so, and they continue to increase. The devices are primarily in the field of medical imaging, most used for medical image analysis. That's what this little figure is trying to show. And again, it's an old publication, but it's still true today, where most of the machine learning is in diagnostic imaging and a little bit of electrodiagnosis. This was well known when we planned for the digital health division in 2017 and before. And that's why we have expertise in diagnostic imaging, software development, image analysis, and as well as machine learning. At the bottom of the slide, I've included a little bullet on adaptive models. And that's something that anyone that has read a little bit about machine learning is you don't have the full benefit of a machine learning model if it's not allowed to learn, right? So we haven't actually authorized any adaptive models, right? This is where the machine learning model is deployed into the clinical environment, and its performance varies with time based on its learning, right? We ensured, as a regulator must, at least at this point in time, we ensure that the algorithms are locked before authorization. And I'll speak more about that later in the presentation. I just wanted to note the sort of first technology authorized by Health Canada and the US FDA was back in 2017, or at least that was the one that publicly acknowledged that they were using machine learning. And this is a more realistic use of machine learning, and it's not necessarily the scary examples that people like to talk about in conversation sometimes about, you know, the autonomous robots. We haven't seen that, right? We're seeing fairly basic software applications like this. And this is simply an automated identification of anatomical structures from MR images. And this was licensed back 5 years ago. And this was shown to be as accurate as manual identification by experienced doctors. So this is a more realistic example. Obviously, there's a little bit more complex since then, but it's not the surgical, you know, autonomous surgical robots that people talk about. On this slide, I just wanted to share the types of products we have seen and authorized in the last few years. And I won't read through every bullet, but this is the type of technology that our digital health group has reviewed for safety and effectiveness. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done to date. A couple notable bullets here. We've looked at some automatic breast density assessments and cancer probability scoring from mammographic images. We've seen some decision assistance software for major depressive disorder. And that actually came through BC's group. We've seen a triage tool for mild traumatic brain injury as well. This was intended to kind of attempt to make informed decisions on the use of head imaging in the emergency department. And right in the middle of the pandemic, so you know, mid-2020, we actually authorized a COVID-related software application to analyze lung x-rays. And that was authorized under our special emergency interim order law during COVID. So these products are novel. They're different than what we're used to reviewing, right? There really isn't any precedent for them, nor are there any international standards for the companies or the regulators to lean on. So in the next couple of slides, what I wanted to do is go through some topics that our technical teams, our physicists and engineers and software experts and clinical experts go through when we assess these types of products. Okay, so our review teams are actually quite experienced. We've been doing this for quite a number of years now when we assess AI products in healthcare. But what do we actually look at? And I want to draw attention to the sum consideration. So the sum in the title of this slide. We assess way more than these 4 items, but I just wanted to highlight a few that are fairly unique to AI and machine learning. Firstly, bias, or more specifically, the quality of the training data. As a regulator of these products, we need to be assured that the product will perform acceptably and equally on Canada's very diverse population. Performance metrics is a big one as well. Obviously, for either a product that doesn't use AI, but performance metrics is an important one. You know, is it being used to detect cancer, or is it being used, let's say, to rule out a wrist fracture? Well, the performance of that product will vary depending on the intended use, right? I have here on the third from the left, clinical environment, or for me, it's sort of interoperability. You know, we need to consider that the AI tool or the medical device that uses AI is integrated appropriately in the clinical environment without unintended consequences. We're hearing from a ton of our Canadian AI experts that if you put a model in a different environment than what it was trained in, it has a high likelihood of not performing as intended. And the last one is fostering innovation, right? You know, we are the regulator. We need to balance safety, but we also need to make sure that we acknowledge the benefit that some of these innovations bring to Canadians. So we really need to balance that sort of safety with facilitating market access for these innovative products, right? If you set the bar too high, we won't have any of these innovative products in Canada. That's not good for anybody. Okay, just providing, maybe unpacking those a little bit more, fostering innovation. I've included here the 6 levels of automation, and that's intended to describe autonomous vehicles. And we see huge parallels in the AI medical device world. You know, in cars, we started with cruise control, or again, I'm going to make fun of my age again. My first car didn't have cruise control, but you know, in cars, you start with cruise control. Now we have like adaptive cruise control that can kind of monitor the car in front of you. It has a lane assist to keep you in the lane. You know, assistive braking maybe. People have heard about Tesla's autopilot. So, you know, in AI medical software, it seems to be following the same trend. Companies aren't building the surgical, autonomous surgical robots. They're building Canadians' trust in these systems, right? We're seeing diagnostic algorithms that assist a doctor or physician, but don't replace them. You know, perhaps our AI medical products are level 1 or level 2, and it's probably small on your screen, but level 1 says, you know, driver assistance, which would be cruise control. Okay. I'll skip effective regulations. I'm going to speak about it later on. Training data and bias, right? That's huge for us. You know, how reliable and representative is the training data? Can the software be used across Canada? And without going into specifics, this Nature publication, which I love to reference in talks like this, showed that the performance of an algorithm, the algorithm or the model was trained to detect brides, right? It was extremely effective on the images that resembled the one on the left, and not as effective on images that resembled those on the right. Why? Right? The developer said, well, it was trained on a global data set, right? But that data set was biased in favor of North American images, and therefore, that resulted in a difference in performance. So we really need to be sure about what data we're using to train these algorithms. And the regulator needs to dig in as well. Verification of validation. Any of you that are aware of how you test an AI algorithm, that's different from how you test, let's say, your calculator, right? If you press 2 + 2, you know what the output's going to be, right? And if it's right, if it's 4, then you put a check mark and say, yeah, it's performing as intended. For an AI algorithm, what is the best way to test these algorithms? You know, should they follow kind of standard medical device software verification, or should they be challenged, let's say, with a test set? Performance metrics, I kind of alluded to that a little bit. You know, are you detecting cancer versus are you ruling out, let's say, a wrist fracture? Performance metrics really depend on the intended use. Interoperability. This is an interesting one, and actually, Goodfellow. This is coming from Goodfellow. This was the MIT Tech Review. Goodfellow just switched jobs. He just joined DeepMind from Apple, but he's a big AI guru, and he showed that some models or algorithms could be tricked, right? If you give a specific image detection model, right, that says, okay, that's a cat, and that's a horse, and that's a panda. If you add a little bit of noise to an image, it will just completely be perturbed. It'll say, oh yeah, no, that's definitely a gibbon, and a gibbon is, you know, kind of a monkey-looking type animal. So it's completely wrong if you just add noise to an image. So we really have to make sure that these algorithms are robust to make sure that they perform as intended, you know, in the real world. Okay. Just again, unpacking a little bit more standards. Standards work is ongoing, but there's really limited safety standards for AI-enabled devices. Ethics, you know, and not specifically related to safety or our jurisdiction under the medical devices regulations. We need to consider any policy or regulatory decisions that take into account kind of underrepresented populations, so that we don't inadvertently, let's say, widen any health inequalities. And I'll skip maybe I'll tell you a little bit about that publication. The Canadian Association of Radiologists published a white paper on the legal issues related to AI. And this essentially, from a medical image that was completely anonymized, they could see a person's face, and therefore the anonymity of the data set was compromised, or at least put in question. Lastly, adaptive or continuous learning, right? AI products their designs, that their performance usually can change over time. And that's a difficult problem to solve as a regulator. How do we authorize a medical device based on it being safe and effective today when we don't know how it's going to evolve tomorrow or next month? And in Canada, our regulations are written in such a way that, you know, if the performance of an algorithm or performance of a software tool is modified, then they need reauthorization from us. And that's a big barrier. That's a barrier for machine learning in general, for innovators, for regulators, but ultimately for patients, right? We want those adaptive models to be continuously updated and, fingers crossed, hopefully improve their performance with time and more data. So what are we doing about this? This is something that we've been extremely active on for AI and machine learning. We've had extensive engagement campaigns across Canada with a ton of experts across our country. Not only that, we're active on the global stage as well. We're an active member within the WHO, the World Health Organization's AI for Health Focus Group. We've led a Canadian team to meetings with the G7. In fact, 2 G7 papers were published, I think early January, I believe, with our input. At the end of October, 7 months ago now, we published a joint statement with the US FDA and the UK's regulator, the MHRA, on good machine learning practices in medical device development. I've added a QR code here on the slide, and I encourage you to check that out. Those 10 principles are definitely the start of something between multiple regulators. So, and we're also active on the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. They have an AI group that we participate in. And just recently, it was decided that Health Canada was going to be co-chairing an international working group on software as a medical device. And we also get advice from our scientific advisory committee in digital. And, while we've had to kind of shift resources a little bit since 2020, we're hoping to get back on our first guidance to industry on locked machine learning enabled devices. So I'm just going to spend one slide on this. This is a draft guidance for our locked. We're hoping to have this for consultation this summer in the next few months or so. But the guidance is likely going to include definitions, you know, so that making sure that industry and the regulator are speaking the same language. As well, we're considering to have it include recommendations for industry and software developers on descriptions of how the model and the algorithm was developed, how the user can see how the model made its recommendations. Some of you may know that to be explainability. We are specifically calling out elements of the manufacturer's risk analysis there. And lastly, and this is a really important topic, is transparency. And I've actually bolded it there at the bottom of your slide. What type of information is provided to users related to performance for an AI algorithm? You know, for example, is the software 90% accurate at detecting disease? What if it's only 70% accurate or sensitive for detecting disease? We want the user to know that. So we really want the end user to understand what the algorithm or the model can and cannot do, so that they're fully informed. So this isn't new. This isn't a Health Canada initiative. The description of the performance of some of these models is either it's been spoken about with other regulators, but also larger companies as well that aren't necessarily or exclusively in AI in healthcare. Google has model cards where it's essentially a descriptor of what the model can. Okay, I promised I was going to speak a little bit about adaptive algorithms. On the left, that's the current state of AI regulation within Health Canada. The model is trained, it's locked, and it's sold. If that model is retrained, it needs reauthorization. And that leads to weeks, perhaps months of delays or approvals. And most importantly, it really kind of delays Canadians' access to some of these really innovative products. On the right, that's the ideal scenario. The algorithm has access to the data, it learns, and hopefully improves and benefits the healthcare system and patients, you know, almost instantaneously. Well, that's a huge challenge, as I mentioned earlier, right? How do you regulate a product today that will be different for tomorrow? So we're working on it. and we're proud that Health Canada is moving forward in developing a specific regulatory pathway for adaptive machine learning enabled medical devices. And the main message on this slide is to compare what's currently done to regulate medical devices with medical devices in general. And what our current proposal is to allow these adaptive models to be sold in Canada, but still maintain appropriate oversight on them, right? So on the top of the slide, top right, it's a super oversimplified way of getting a a medium to high risk product to market. Those of you who know our classification system, that's a class 3, class 4. The manufacturer requests market access. Health Canada assesses the pre-market evidence, and once and then should we give authorization, it's then used on the market, and we have oversight in the post-market as well. But consider the life cycle approach on the bottom right. The manufacturer now has 2 ways to market: through Health Canada, right through the middle, and direct access to the user, should they have an approved plan for this. Well, how would we do that? Well, Health Canada would maintain regulatory oversight, forgive me, in all areas of the life cycle, but we'd use concepts like we would assess the company's machine learning practices, or essentially we'd assess the company's ability to make a good machine learning enabled device. We'd pre-authorize a future state of the product. We'd pre-authorize the method on how to get to that future state. And we'd also bolster or enhance our post-market monitoring in the real world. So the company would have to apply for market access normally, right? But in fact, they'd actually have to do a little bit more work at the beginning. But after their product is authorized, along with an authorized plan, and as long as they stay within that plan, they can deploy that product straight to the user. Now, we're not pretending that these are new concepts at all. They'd be new to Canada for sure, but we want to give credit to the other jurisdictions like the US. Sorry, I have a couple. One of them is a screenshot of the proposed regulatory framework from the FDA from 2019. So giving credit to the FDA and the Japanese PMDA. The FDA has proposed this concept. The Japanese PMDA and MHLW had actually enacted that into legislation. So it's a concept that's getting some international impacts. So we really see some positive impacts to the Canadian healthcare system with this proposal. Our vision is really simple. We remove some pre-market barriers. We add additional pre-market requirements and an appropriate level of oversight to the post-market. And what we can do is we can really foster access for patients. We can promote innovation. We can test some of the new concepts like classification, like pre-authorization of a future state, and we can align internationally, and that's huge as well. All while maintaining our high standard for protecting the health and safety of Canadians, which is our. So this is my last real slide. Actually, no, it is my last slide. And I wanted to end on a request, and it's a request of you. And this speaks to the advice question that Kirin had mentioned to BC at the beginning, right? What advice do you have? And then this isn't necessarily advice, but it's a call. My slide here is a call. It's a call for increased collaboration among stakeholders, right? So Health Canada, we, the Digital Health Group, we're proud of some of the collaborations that we have now with healthcare providers and users, academia, industry, international partners, but there's always room for more. We all want the same thing, right? And in the digital health world, working closely is almost, at least from my experience, is a necessity, right? On the right, I've listed some questions that I've been asked in forums like this. And my answer is usually always the same. It's increased communication. It's increased collaboration and communication. Going over a couple of them, how does a physician know the limitations of an authorized AI algorithm? Well, it's increased communication between the manufacturer and the regulator and the user. Anyways, I'll leave it there. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. I'll see.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was very informative. So we do actually have a lot of questions. So we will try to take a few questions before the end of this webinar. And don't worry, for those questions that we don't have time to answer, we will send them to Mark, and he will have the chance to answer your question after by email. First question, how is, so it's on slide 7 in your presentation. So how is changes to performance defined? In other words, how are hardware and software updates determined to warrant resubmission? How is this definition different from the FDA and Health Canada?
It's a very good question. I can give you the 30-minute version or the 30-second version. I think that briefly, the changes to performance, and this is a direct reference to what we consider as a significant change. So in the regulations, they're for submitting a license amendment, is that for a class 3 or 4 application, if the device undergoes a significant change, it needs reauthorization. Well, what does significant change mean? We have guidance on this particular topic. So I encourage you to check it out. If you can't find it on our website, please let me know and I'll send you the link. It's fairly large document, and it describes significant changes related to design and sterilization. But there's one particular section on software. It sort of draws the line between what is significant and what is not. So what do you need to document in sort of annual renewal and not come into the regulator for? Or is it significant that, yes, you need a license amendment application to come in and get reauthorization? So my brief answer to that is the changes to performance is synonymous with the term significant change. And we have a big document, guidance document on that. Obviously, not just the change in software, so that can be even an operating system change is a significant change that requires authorization, reauthorization. But when we start talking about changes to performance, I'm looking at your question right now on my screen, that's more than just a minor software change. That is a change to the performance of the product. So that could be considered, perhaps maybe even a change in design, a change in intended use even. Which again is all documented in that significant change guidance. So Jacob, great question. And if you can't find the significant change guidance on our website, email me and I'll get you the link. Okay.
Okay. So next question is, can you clarify what medical devices need Health Canada approval and which do not? For instance, next generation sequencing that is used in whole genome sequencing or liquid biopsy testing have not been Health Canada approved, but are used clinically by Canadian labs. Why?
Lester knows his stuff. So this is again an onion type question where we can discuss at length what this how to answer this. What medical devices need Health Canada approval? So we know our risk class 1 to class 4, and obviously the requirements for pre-market approval vary depending on how risky the product is. I want to draw attention to, and I'll keep my comments specific to pre-market and not necessarily BC's world in clinical trials, but in pre-market, you need a medical device license to sell, import, or distribute that product, and that's really the crux of this question, or the answer to this question, is that if there is if there's a product that is being sold, imported, or distributed, when I say a product, a medical device, then that medical device needs authorization. If there's no selling or importing or distributing, then there are other provisions in legislation that allow for the safety of that product. So we don't necessarily have regulatory oversight on that. So when you're saying about lab developed tests, for example, those are not products that are sold. Therefore, we have limited regulatory oversight on that particular item. That's different for clinical trials, and it is also known to us, so that we're working on trying to have a little bit more oversight in that area. Thanks, Lester. It's a good question, and you know your stuff.
Thank you very much. And another question, what class do most AI machine learning algorithms that operate as a medical solution fall under?
Great question, and I would love to answer it. 2, 3, or 4. If I was to make a histogram of them, they'd likely be between 2 and 3. But if you start talking about closed loop, and again, not sure, I'm sure a lot of you know our regulation and our classification rules. If we start talking about algorithms that are closed loop, then that could be a 4. But what we're seeing now are, I would say, less risky. So it's not necessarily an autonomous diagnosis. So it doesn't say Mark has cancer and triage me. It will be usually an aid to the physician about, look here, there's something weird here in Mark's lung. So that would be in a class 2, class 3 category. What I do recommend is, whenever I get a question like this, our software as a medical device guidance document was published in 2019. It is based on internationally harmonized definitions on this, of the state of the healthcare situation. So is it serious or critical, as well as, is it driving or informing clinical management or even diagnosing? And it gives a little bit of a matrix of what classification it should be in. So it's, are you a medical device? And if so, what class are you? And it's specific to software. So that is a huge resource there. I highly encourage you to take a look at our software as a medical device guidance document. And it even gives classification examples.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question in reference to slide 10 on bias. According to which criteria does HC, Health Canada, make a determination that the training data is obtained from a sample of sufficient size and is sufficiently representative, in which there are enough patients from all clinical demographic and or socioeconomic subgroups deemed relevant by Health Canada?
Yeah, so we don't have a checklist to determine that. We rely on our experts to take multiple considerations into account. When I say that, risk is a big one, because at the end of the day, our recommendations are whether or not a product gets refused or authorized is based on benefit risk. So, for example, if we have a fairly low risk product that has been tested, shown to be effective, shown to be safe, and has a positive benefit risk ratio, then we will be more inclined to authorize that product, let's say on a limited data set, okay? One thing I want to highlight is that we also review into the intended use. So there are some times where, let's say there's a product that is intended for women 18 to 40. Well, we won't look at Canada's very diverse population. We will make sure that the training data set matches the intended use, right? So size, sufficiently representative, that's also a very tricky question to answer. The onus is on the manufacturer to demonstrate to us that it is of sufficient size and sufficiently representative. That is a question that we often ask applicants, is tell us why this is sufficiently representative. And I just, before we move to another question, this is a really good one. This is still being discussed internationally. Do we want our entire Canadian population represented in one data set? It's likely more beneficial if we have a product that is representative of the population that's intended to be used in. I'll give you an example. If I have a product that is intended to be used in a remote or rural healthcare setting where a radiologist is not around, I'm thinking, let's say, our northern communities. I would much rather have that training data set representative of northern communities than urban Toronto or urban Quebec City, right? So there's always that determination as well. So it's a case by case. We don't have a criteria or checklist, but that's something that we are speaking about with other regulators, that what is better, a big general pot of data or very specific data sets. So anyways, thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. And another question, does Health Canada follow any guidelines for AI algorithm in the medical context? If so, can you point us in the right direction?
So I may have to get clarification on that question. Follow any guidelines for AI algorithms in the medical context. I would, if we're talking about guidelines or guidances, we don't necessarily follow, we are writing them with partners. So that's some of our work with the G7, that's some of our work with the WHO, that's some of our work even with international regulators. Sometimes we have bilateral meetings with the FDA and Europe. So what we do follow is typically what we write. So I do want to kind of reassure the participants that, and I don't want to sound condescending at all, but the guidelines are very limited. So we are actively involved in writing those guidelines. If we're talking about standards, also very limited amount of standards for AI algorithms, but we are even involved in developing those internationally harmonized standards. So ISO and IEC standards for AI and medical devices, we have a team member that's on that working group. I hope that answers it.
Thank you. So I'm just going to take 2 more questions, as we have already, we are already late on the time. So how do you see the evolution of Health Canada, CADTH, and provincial health authority roles? In particular, something can be approved by Health Canada, but not accessible to Canadian because it is not recommended by CADTH or not paid for by provincial health authorities. These silos are a barrier to the adoption of new technologies in healthcare.
So Lester, I can't see you, but I hope you're smiling. You know your stuff. How do I see it? Well, this would be speculation. It would be my opinion. So I have to kind of get away from my opinion or speculation. I do want to reassure you that I've been around in Health Canada for 12 years. I've never seen so much collaboration with CADTH and provincial health authorities in digital health and AI than I have today. So I think we're definitely getting closer to collaboration. Evolution of, yeah, so even in digital health, I spoke a little bit about 2018 where digital health group was created. In that mandate of creating the digital health group, we were tasked with sort of accessibility and working closer with CADTH. And this is something that I even sit on the National AI Council for AI in healthcare with CADTH. So we also work with our Federation of Medical Authorities and Provincial Health Authorities in AI. So I can't necessarily speculate on how I see the evolution, but I do want to reassure you that I'm seeing some convergence for sure. And it kind of speaks to my last slide that collaboration is essential in this space. But noted, your comment is noted, and all I can say is we're working on it, and I'm seeing good things.
Thank you very much. And finally, I'm going to take the last question. So I'm going to read the last question, sorry. So we have developed a novel AI-based technology to convert speech of people with speech disabilities into clear audio, closed captions, or communicating with virtual assistants. Would this fall within the scope of areas mentioned? What would be the best contact?
Yeah, really good. It's hard for me to kind of on the spot saying, yes, you are a medical device, and yes, you are this risk class. What I encourage you to do is take a look at the software as a medical device guidance document. So what we do ask, and now I'm speaking on behalf of some of our front end team and not necessarily the pre-market assessment group, but what we ask is that future applicants take a look at available guidance, give a concerted effort to determine yourselves if you are a medical device and what risk class you are, if you are a medical device, and then come into our team for reassurance or guidance or confirmation, if you will. What I can do is I put my email address in the chat. please just email me. I'll connect you to the right person. So it's not necessarily myself or my team that is going to say, yes, you are medical device and here's your risk class, but I can contact, I can route you to the right person rather than me putting the generic inbox in the chat. So email me, my email's in the chat.
Thank you very much, Mark. So this is now time to end this webinar. So I would like to thank all the participants for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. I also wanted to thank the expert from Health Canada for their time and their presentation. That was very informative. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you. Bye, everyone.